Hey everybody, and welcome to another Tausken review. Today we'll be taking a look at an all-new indie retro-like FPS called Cultic, which is among many new retro FPS games that have been coming out in the recent years, like Medieval, Dusk, Proteus, and many others. And let me say, I'm a huge fan of these types of games, so this is right up my alley. Cultic tries to differentiate itself a little bit by taking on the cult-like setting, hence the name. This game is definitely inspired by the old game Blood, if you've ever heard of that, so it definitely takes inspiration from that. Much like all these other retro FPS games, this game is really more about the actual gameplay and the combat than it is about any kind of story. There's no voiced protagonist, and while there is a story, it's pretty bare bones. You find things here and there across the maps as you wander around, different notes and things, and there's certain events that'll take place within the course of the game that certainly progress the story, but overall, the game isn't really about the story. It's more about the gameplay. So what is Cultic doing with its gameplay and how does it differentiate itself? Well, it's definitely like somewhat of an arena shooter. It's very fast paced, especially if you turn on the auto run mechanic, but ultimately it's not going to be as fast paced as something like Proteus or a Medieval or probably even Dusk, honestly. It's kind of a hybrid. It's more leaning towards something like a Wolfenstein or Original Doom than it is, say, the kind of more modern Quake style fast paced shooters, but it definitely is pretty fast paced still. You can play the game as kind of two different ways. If you want, you could play it more as kind of a survival shooter, trying to like hide, take cover, and different things. But I would recommend playing this game more as kind of a fast paced, sort of Quake like gameplay where you're kind of just running and gunning. The core of Cultic is really the shooting, which feels pretty solid. Most of the guns are pretty fun to use, and the explosions, the animations that occur with enemies blowing up and dying, different explosives that you can use is certainly fun. The weapons for the first half of the game, I'd say, are a bit standard, and so this can be a little bit boring. You're getting generic like rifles, pistols, shotguns. They all feel pretty fun to play and use, but generally they're kind of bland. The longer you go, you do get some more exotic weapons like flamethrowers and stuff, and the balance, to be honest with you, is not quite the greatest. Some weapons like the Sten, which is kind of like your machine gun, is pretty terrible, honestly. It's pretty much useless. The best weapons in the games are generally the bombs and other interactables, which, let me tell you, much like Half-Life, the amount of different explosive barrels you can pick up and throw around the place is crazy and all over the place. And I'm all for it. I love the big explosions and the interesting types of gameplay experiences that it gives you to try and open things up a little bit. You also have tons of different bombs, Molotovs, and other weapons that are incredibly effective at destroying mass amounts of enemies. I'm not quite sure that I like the slowdown mechanic. Basically, if you get like a headshot or some other things, you may go into a slower mode where you can kind of move around like you're in slow motion. I feel like this kind of goes at odds with the game's mechanics, and I don't really like this in arena shooters in particular. To me personally, this may be something that you might enjoy, but I personally feel like this kind of just goes at odds with the game's fast paced nature and design to kind of slow everything down so much. I did find that for the first half of the game, I wasn't quite enjoying it as much as the last half. The first half of the game has a lot of like caves and really boring, bland locations. The game relies a lot upon browns and grays, which is not a very enjoyable or exciting gameplay experience for the first couple hours. Towards the later half, the game does try to mix things up a little bit. It starts to add more interesting locations and dynamics, but you have to kind of go through a lot of slog to really get there. This also carries over to the enemy design, which I wish was a little bit greater. Basically, you fight pretty much nothing but cultist spam that are just reskins of one another with slight changes in mechanics. This is a bit boring. Towards the later half of the game, they do introduce some more types of enemies and certain things that'll spice things up a little bit, but by that point, it feels a little bit late. They also add some enemies that are basically reskins of earlier enemies, like skeletons, which are pretty much just reskinned cultists, which is kind of bland. There's also some boss fights mixed into levels, and much like Doom and other games that try and mix in boss fights into FPS games, I'm not quite sure it really works out here. Some of the boss fights in this game especially are pretty bad. There's one that includes basically a tank that just busts through a wall and then just turns its turret and tries to blast you. Really boring, unoriginal, and uninteresting where you kind of just spam throw different grenades or explosives or incendiaries or your weapon and just kill it to death. It's not very fun. I don't think it's a very interesting or fun boss to fight. Towards the later half of the game, they do add a little bit more interesting types of bosses, but by that point it did feel a little bit late. The sounds are pretty decent. The weapons and ambience sound pretty good. The soundtrack is solid when it works, but for the most part, the first couple levels, I felt like, especially during that first level or two, there's a lot of idle time where it's not really playing much in the background, which, I don't know, maybe this is designed to give you some downtime or something, but it did feel a little bit quiet and like the game could use some more noise. If you're a fan of like exploring and finding things, these maps are pretty open-ended. They're not quite restricted, so there's a lot of different areas you can wander off to with different secrets to find or different ammo and weapon parts. There is a bit of a shortage in this game in terms of like actually finding ammo, so wandering and exploring can certainly be a great way to get yourself a lot of extra ammo. And the weapon parts is an additional system I haven't talked about yet, but basically you can upgrade your weapons to make them more powerful, getting things like more damage, bigger mag size, etc. It is worth mentioning that they're intending this game to be sort of a chapter one of a later going series. So hopefully going forward they can try and expand upon things like the enemy variety and other things by expanding on things in more of the fantastical direction. Overall, for a game made by one guy, Cultic is still pretty fun. I do have some gripes about the game. I wish that the enemy variety was a little bit better, as well as the level variety. Some of the missions are just kind of boring with the amount of grays and drab caves and browns everywhere. Hopefully, they can up this a little bit in the Chapter 2 section and maybe get into more of the fantastical stuff, perhaps leaning more into kind of cultic fantasy type stuff, which would be really cool. But overall, for $10, can you really complain that much? I got a couple hours worth out of enjoyment of this game, and once you complete it, you can play more of a survival type mode. So there's a lot to be had here. A lot of different gameplay, a lot of different things to mix with, and if you like that kind of boomer shooter type stuff, I think this game is still pretty fun to play.